the next generation in 8-bit ZX Spectrum technology, or a failed attempt to claw back some of the 16-bit market from more powerful competitors? This is the SAM Coupe. Through the mid to late 1980s, the British home computer market was dominated by Sinclair's ZX Spectrum range. This humble Z80 based microcomputer with either 48 or 128k of RAM and almost all of its software coming on tape was the dominant force in the market, mostly due to its cheap nature. Now, for years, Spectrum fans had wanted a more powerful piece of kit. Sinclair had kind of promised this with the QL, although that turned out to be a complete bust, and rumblings began in the late 80s of a Super Spectrum. This Super Spectrum became known as the SAM Coupe. Now, the SAM Coupe was, to all intents and purposes, a turbocharged Z80 based system, which intended to try to gain some market that was being lost to the newer, more expensive 16-bit systems such as the Atari ST and the Commodore Amiga. Now, would the SAM Coupe be a success? Well, chances are you've probably never heard of it. At best, it was a cult hit, arriving on the market, many would argue, too late to have an impact. But, as we'll see in this video, it was actually a capable little machine, and had it arrived when it should have arrived initially, it may have been more successful. Anyway, let's take a look at the SAM Coupe. Now, being an 8-bit system and looking for Spectrum compatibility, the SAM Coupe was based around the Zilog Z80B CPU, which was clocked at 6 MHz and also had a 10,000 gate ASIC attached. Now, the ASIC was similar to the ULA in the ZX Spectrum in that it performed various roles, including the graphics output. Now, the system came with either 256k or 512k of RAM internally, but up to another 4 MB could be added externally via the Euro connector socket on the back. The graphics output through the ASIC was capable of 4 different display modes. Modes 1, 2, 3 and 4. Now, mode 1 was basically the exact same as the ZX Spectrum. So you had a 256 by 192 display in 8x8 pixel blocks. That ran at a decent colour depth. Mode 2 was very similar but had separate colour attributes for each 8 pixel wide block. Mode 3 ran at 512 by 192 in 4 colour mode, and finally mode 4, which ran at 256 by 192 pixels resolution in 16 colour mode. Now, in terms of audio, the audio was handled by a Philips SAA1099 sound and noise generator, which produced 8-octave stereo sound across up to 6 channels, I believe. Obviously, it had a custom firmware, and the floppy disk drive that was used on the system was a standard 3.5 inch drive, which had up to 800k, although thanks to the file system, only about 785k was available to the user. Now, obviously, there were a number of external ports. There was a non-standard SCART connector, a 64-pin Euro connector, a mouse socket, a light gun socket, MIDI in and out ports, a standard Atari 9-pin joystick port, and a 3.5mm mono cassette jack, because software could also be loaded from audio cassette. Now, in terms of these specs and the so-called Super Spectrum abilities, the Coupe was compatible with the 48K model of the Spectrum. Now, the 128K machine was not compatible with the SAM Coupe due to memory address issues, but there were hacks that could get 128k only games working on the Coupe. Now, because the SAM ran at approximately double the speed of the Spectrum, the CPU had to be downclocked by the introduction of wait states to slow the processor down. Now, commercially, the SAM Coupe was not a successful machine. Launching in 1989, it was discontinued officially in 1992, and in that time they only sold approximately 12,000 units of hardware. Now, by any definition, that's a pretty hefty failure, especially when you think that, say, the Spectrum sold in the millions, even the Commodore 64 in the UK market had a substantial 7-figure sales to account for the hardware, so 12,000 was pretty poor, but it was timing. In 1989, the Atari ST and the Commodore Amiga 500 had fallen to what you would call acceptable pricing. They reached the level where people could afford to purchase them quite easily compared to a few years before, and this obviously affected it, because if you could get one of the fancy new 16-bit machines, why would you buy an 8-bit machine? Now, that isn't to say that the SAM Coupe was massively underpowered compared to these 16-bit machines. As you're about to see, it could produce some pretty good looking games. For example, take Prince of Persia here. The SAM Coupe version of Prince of Persia looks every bit as good as any of the 16-bit home computer versions you'd care to mention. The Apple II GS, the ST, the Amiga, it looks as good as those and plays just as well. It's a superb game for the system. Also, as you can now see on screen, Defenders of the Earth. Yes, it's flick screen, but it looks a huge step ahead of its 8-bit cousins on the Spectrum, the CPC, the C64, and is again getting up there towards looking like a 16-bit title. There are also some other titles such as Lemmings, which again looks barely indistinguishable from the 16-bit versions of the games. In the right hands, the SAM Coupe was and remains a powerful machine. There are still games being produced for it to this day by a small but dedicated group of fans. Indeed, there's even new hardware expansions being produced for the Coupe. So, you know, yes, it's obscure, yes, it was a failure, but it lives on. And to be fair, yeah, as I said, it just hit the market at the wrong time. Had the Coupe arrived in, say, 1987, early 1988, it may have stood a chance, but by December of 1989, the 16-bit home computers were by that point well established. The new 16-bit consoles, such as the Mega Drive, were starting to appear into the British market. The whole landscape was changing, and the idea of the plucky British competitor like Sinclair or Miles Gordon Technologies, as it was behind the SAM, just couldn't compete anymore. It was a real case, sadly, of too little too late, and a very, very sad case of what might have been. Now, if you've enjoyed this episode, do feel free to hit the like button. You can hit the dislike button if you wish, if you've not enjoyed it. If you really enjoyed what you've seen, please do subscribe to the channel. Ring the bell to be notified of new uploads. As I do keep mentioning, I do have YouTube memberships and a Patreon membership on here. So big shout outs again to Old Scott Retro and Leftback for being my current members. Much love to you guys. And I will see you all on the next video. So this is Rob, signing off from 81632-bit, and I'll see you on the next one.